Welcome to Creepy Horror Tales. I'm so glad you're here. This channel is your go-to spot for spine-chilling stories that thrill and captivate. While our tales may be scary and spooky, they're also perfect for those moments when you want to relax and embrace a little excitement. So, settle in, let the eerie atmosphere wash over you, and enjoy the delightful chills that await. I've always lived in a small town, one of those places that you drive through and don't even notice. It's the kind of place where everybody knows each other's business, and secrets don't stay buried for long. But there was always something different about my grandfather. He kept to himself more than anyone else in town, and there were things about him that I could never quite put my finger on. When I was younger, I stayed with my mom and dad in the city, only visiting Grandpa during summer breaks. His house, set just outside the main part of town, was a big, old thing, built probably over a century ago, with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with all sorts of weird knickknacks. Grandpa never talked about where any of the stuff came from, and I learned pretty quickly not to ask. He'd just give me this look, not quite angry, but it was like I'd touched a nerve. Anyway, when my parents died in a car accident a couple of years ago, I had no choice but to move in with him. At first, it wasn't all that bad. I mean, sure, the house was a little creepy and there was no good cell service out there, but he always made sure I was taken care of. He didn't talk much, but I figured that was just his way of grieving. Or maybe it was just how he'd always been. But then, things started happening. I don't know exactly when I noticed it. Maybe it was one night when I couldn't sleep and thought I heard someone whispering just outside my door. The voice was low, almost like it was trying not to be heard, but it was there. I opened the door, expecting to see Grandpa or someone, but the hallway was empty. After that, I started hearing things more often. Sometimes it was scratching coming from behind the walls like mice or something, but the sounds were too deliberate, too slow. Other nights, I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow moving across the far wall, even though there shouldn't have been anything there to cast it. Grandpa would always tell me to stop worrying. "The house is old," he'd say. "Old houses make noise." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the more time went on, the more I felt like I wasn't alone in that house. It was sometime around last winter that I finally started poking around the house when he wasn't there. I'd seen him go into the attic a few times, always carrying up one of his old leather-bound books. He never left them lying around, and anytime I asked what was in them, he'd change the subject. So, one day when he was out in town for his weekly grocery run, I decided to check it out myself. The attic was dusty, just like you'd expect, with boxes piled up everywhere and old furniture draped in sheets. It smelled like mold and something else, something I couldn't quite place. But it was in one corner, beneath an old quilt that looked like it had been there for decades, that I found the books. They weren't like normal journals. They were filled with symbols and diagrams, all written in a language I didn't understand. Some of the pages had drawings, creatures that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen, with eyes in places they shouldn't have been and limbs that bent in ways that made me feel sick. It was like staring into someone's nightmare. There were other things too. Strange metal objects that looked like tools, but with no real purpose I could figure out. And jars, lots of them, filled with things I couldn't identify. Some had dried herbs or powders, but others had, well, I'm not really sure. I was putting one of the books back when I heard a noise behind me. It wasn't like the whispers I'd heard before. It was more of a low growl, like some animal had gotten into the house. I turned around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness at the top of the attic stairs. After that, things around Grandpa got different. He started locking the attic door, for one. And there were nights I'd hear him talking in his room, whispering, almost like he was arguing with someone, though I never heard another voice respond. When I'd ask him about it, he'd just tell me I was imagining things again. But then, people in town started disappearing. It wasn't like a huge wave of missing persons or anything, but enough to get people talking. First, it was old Mrs. Wilcox, who everyone figured had just wandered off. She had been getting forgetful, after all. Then, there was this guy who worked at the gas station. They said he'd left town suddenly, but nobody really believed it because he'd been here his whole life. It wasn't long before the rumors started. Talk about strange lights in the woods at night, weird animal sightings, and some folks even saying they'd seen shadows moving in the trees. One night, I decided to confront Grandpa about what I found in the attic. I don't know what I was expecting, really, but definitely not what happened. I caught him in the middle of the night, packing up some of his old books. He froze when he saw me, and I could tell from the look in his eyes that he'd known all along I'd been snooping around. I asked him straight up if he was involved in what was happening around town, and if those weird books in the attic had anything to do with it. He didn't answer right away, just sighed and told me to sit down. That's when he started to explain. Apparently, he'd been doing something. He wouldn't call it magic or sorcery or anything like that, but he had this way of working with certain forces, as he put it. He said the things in the journals weren't demons exactly, but something close enough. He'd been trying to summon them, or create them. I'm still not sure which. And for a long time, he'd had control. But then something had gone wrong. He wouldn't tell me how or why, just that he couldn't stop it anymore. I was furious. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him what kind of person would bring something like that into our world. But before I could say anything else, we heard the sound. It was coming from outside, a deep, guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Grandpa's face went pale, and he grabbed my arm, practically dragging me out the back door. We ran into the woods, but it was like the shadows were alive out there, moving in ways they shouldn't have. Grandpa kept muttering to himself, something about needing to get to the old chapel at the edge of town. He said there was a way to seal them back, to send them away. I didn't understand half of what he was saying, but I followed him anyway. When we got to the chapel, it was clear we weren't alone. There was this thing. It wasn't human, or at least not anymore. It stood at the altar, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow, and it smiled when it saw us. Grandpa pushed me behind him and started chanting something in that weird language from the books. The thing didn't like that. It charged at us, and for a moment, I thought that was it, that we were going to die. But Grandpa did something, I don't know what, and there was this bright flash of light. When I opened my eyes, the thing was gone. But so was Grandpa. It took me a long time to process everything. The townspeople never found out what really happened to those who went missing. They chalked it up to a wild animal, or maybe even some kind of cult. And I didn't have the heart to tell them otherwise. Now, it's just me living in that old house. I've kept Grandpa's journals, even though I've sealed the attic door and try not to think about the things inside. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear whispers coming from upstairs. And sometimes I wonder if one day they'll come back for me too. After Grandpa was gone, the silence in the house felt different. Before, the quiet had been comforting in a way, like the whole world outside just fell away. But now, it was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark corners of every room. I spent the first few days just going through the motions, barely eating, barely sleeping. I kept expecting him to walk through the door or hear his footsteps creaking down the hallway. But all I heard was the house settling and those faint whispers I'd come to know too well. I didn't tell anyone what really happened at the chapel. When they found out Grandpa was missing, I just told the cops he'd gone into the woods and never came back. They searched for a few days before giving up, saying that he was probably taken by a wild animal or that he'd gotten lost in the forest and didn't make it through the night. They chalked it up to his age and the fact that no one really knew what he was doing out there anyway. I kept waiting for things to go back to normal, or at least something close to it. But the more time passed, the stranger everything became. I wasn't the only one noticing it either. People in town were talking. They said there were still strange noises in the woods, like growling or the sound of something big moving through the trees. And there were these strange tracks that kept showing up, deep clawed marks in the dirt that no one could identify. It was like whatever Grandpa had been dealing with was still out there, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. I tried to keep to myself. I figured if I stayed quiet and kept my head down, then whatever was going on would just pass by me. But then one night, about a month after Grandpa disappeared, I woke up to the sound of scratching again. It wasn't coming from behind the walls this time, though it was coming from outside my window. I lay there for what felt like hours, just listening. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But as I strained my ears, I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like something with claws was dragging them slowly across the glass. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I was too scared to pull back the curtain, too scared to look. But then, just as I was about to get up and run, the scratching stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. There was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling in the bushes outside. Just silence. The next morning, I went outside to check. There, right beneath my bedroom window, were those same claw marks I'd seen around town. They were deep, gouged into the earth like something was trying to climb up the side of the house. My first thought was to call the police, but then I remembered how they'd looked at me during their last visit, like they thought I was just some scared kid making up ghost stories. They weren't going to believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed myself. I spent that whole day going through Grandpa's journals again, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. There was one entry that caught my eye. It was near the back, written in a different ink than the rest, like he'd added it much later. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. It talked about something he called the breach, a point where the rituals went wrong and something got through. He wrote that he'd been able to contain it for a while, but as time passed, the barrier was weakening, and soon it wouldn't hold at all. I read that passage over and over, and my stomach twisted into knots because, in that moment, I knew whatever Grandpa had brought into this world wasn't finished with me. It had found our house again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and I kept the lights on until my eyes ached from staying open. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the attic. My heart sank. I hadn't gone up there since the night Grandpa disappeared, and I wasn't about to start now. But as the scratching grew louder, something inside me snapped. I was done being afraid, done with feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs. The attic door was closed, and the lock Grandpa had put on it was still latched. But the scratching was coming from the other side, louder now, like whatever was in there knew I was close. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges groaning as I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the flashlight's beam seemed to struggle against the darkness. I swept it over the old boxes and furniture, but there was nothing there. I was about to turn around and leave when the light caught something. A shape hunched over in the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of crates. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rags, but then it moved. It unfolded itself, and I realized I was looking at something that wasn't entirely human. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its limbs seemed to bend in odd angles like they didn't quite fit together. Its eyes, they were the same sickly yellow I'd seen at the chapel, glowing faintly in the dark. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't even scream. It watched me for what felt like an eternity before it finally spoke, its voice a low rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You made a deal," it said, "and now the debt is due." I don't know how I managed to get out of the attic. One moment, I was frozen there, and the next I was halfway down the stairs, my legs moving on pure instinct. I slammed the door behind me and threw the lock back into place, my chest heaving with every breath. After that, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the house, but I had nowhere else to go. So, I started researching. I went through every book Grandpa left behind, every note scribbled in the margins. I spent hours trying to figure out what kind of deal he had made and how I could get rid of whatever was in the attic. I even went to the library in town and dug through old records, trying to find anything that might help me understand what was happening. That's when I found something that chilled me to the bone. In an old newspaper archive, I found an article from years ago, back when Grandpa would have been about my age. It talked about a series of strange occurrences. People going missing, livestock found mutilated, odd symbols appearing around town. There was a picture of a younger version of Grandpa standing in front of the old chapel. He was with a group of men, all of them wearing these long robes. The caption said they were part of some society dedicated to preserving the town's history, but I knew better. I could see it in their eyes, the same haunted look I saw in Grandpa's the night he disappeared. Whatever this society was, it wasn't about history. It was about something else, something darker. The more I dug, the more I found. The old chapel wasn't just a place of worship. It had been used for rituals, just like the ones Grandpa performed. I found mentions of other breaches, other times when things had gone wrong. Each time, the town had covered it up, and each time, someone had to pay the price. It was almost like a pattern, a cycle that kept repeating itself. And now it was my turn. I didn't know how to stop it, but I knew I had to try. The thing in the attic, whatever it was just the beginning. If I didn't find a way to seal the breach, more would come, and I wasn't sure the town could survive another round of disappearances and horrors lurking in the woods. So, I made a plan. I'd take what I'd learned from Grandpa's journals and try to finish what he started. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I figured it was my only shot. I spent days preparing, gathering the old tools and relics from the attic, drawing the symbols I'd seen in the books. And then, on the night of the new moon, I went back to the chapel. It was colder than I remembered, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I lit the candles and placed the relics around the altar, just like the instructions said. As I began to chant the words from Grandpa's journal, the shadows in the chapel seemed to thicken, like they were alive and closing in. At first, nothing happened. I felt a flicker of relief, thinking maybe the worst was over. But then, the temperature dropped even further, and the candles flickered out all at once. The darkness closed in, and I felt something brush past me, something cold and wet, like the touch of a clammy hand. And then I heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it wasn't just in one place. It was all around me. The scratching grew louder, surrounding me like a swarm of unseen creatures. It seemed to be coming from the walls of the chapel itself, as though the very structure was alive, breathing and clawing at me from every direction. I stumbled back, my voice faltering as the chant died in my throat. The darkness felt thick and heavy, pressing against my skin, and I could sense them. Things moving just beyond the edge of my sight, shifting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My hands shook as I tried to light one of the candles again, desperate to push back the darkness. The flame flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space around me, but it was enough to see that I wasn't alone. There in the far corner of the chapel stood the figure from the attic. It hadn't moved, yet somehow it felt closer than before, as if the shadows had drawn it toward me. Its glowing eyes seemed to pulse in the dark, like they were feeding off the fear that gripped my chest. "You're too late," it whispered, the voice like a low rumble of gravel. "The breach cannot be sealed. Not by you." The words sank in cold and final, and for a moment I almost gave up. But then I thought of Grandpa, of all the people who had disappeared, and of the horrible things that I had only glimpsed in his journals. I couldn't just walk away. Not now. If there was even the slightest chance I could fix what he'd started, then I had to try. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the symbols I'd drawn on the floor. I knew they were part of a binding ritual, meant to hold back whatever was trying to break through. I began to chant again, my voice cracking, but growing louder with each word. The air seemed to vibrate around me, and for a moment, I thought I could feel the darkness pulling away, retreating back into the shadows. But then the thing in the corner laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from all around me. It started to move, not walking, but shifting across the floor like a mass of darkness, its limbs stretching and bending in unnatural ways. As it drew closer, I could see its skin more clearly, and it wasn't just stretched tight over bones. It was translucent, almost like a thin film covering something else underneath. And that something was writhing, pushing against the surface, as though it was struggling to break free. I backed up, nearly tripping over the altar as I stumbled. The relics I'd placed there clattered to the ground, rolling across the stone floor. The figure stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on me with a strange, almost curious expression. "You don't understand, do you?" it rasped. "He made the deal for you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For me? I tried to wrap my mind around what that could mean, but there was no time. The shadows were moving again, swirling around the chapel, and I could feel the ground beneath me start to tremble. I had to act, and fast. I scrambled to pick up the fallen relics, my fingers slipping over the cold metal. I grabbed the one that looked most familiar, a small, curved dagger with symbols etched along the blade. I remembered seeing it in one of Grandpa's journals. It was supposed to be used for cutting through the veil, whatever that meant. But I was desperate, and it was the only thing I had. Gripping the dagger tightly, I slashed at the air in front of me, aiming for the thickest part of the shadow. For a moment, it was like cutting through smoke, and I thought it wasn't going to do anything. But then there was a scream, a high-pitched, otherworldly wail that seemed to split the air itself. The shadow recoiled, pulling back from the edge of the blade as though it had been burned. The figure snarled, and its glowing eyes flared bright, blindingly so. I stumbled back, the light from its eyes searing through the darkness. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything except a bright, burning whiteness. I blinked hard, trying to clear my sight, and when the world finally came back into focus, I saw that the thing in front of me had changed. It was no longer just a shadowy figure. It was shifting and unraveling, as though its form was made of countless strands of darkness that writhed and twisted around each other. The dagger in my hand felt heavier now, like it was resisting my grip. I tried to steady myself, but my legs felt weak, and a deep coldness was spreading from the blade into my arm. It was as if the dagger itself was alive, pulsing with some dark energy that seemed to leach the warmth from my skin. I forced myself to take a step forward, raising the dagger again, but the figure let out a guttural laugh that made my stomach twist. "You can't cut away what's already inside you," it growled. I froze. The words seemed to echo through my bones, resonating with a truth that I didn't want to accept. What did it mean, already inside me? I glanced down at the dagger, at the strange symbols etched into its blade, and for the first time, I noticed a faint glow coming from the markings, pulsing in time with the beat of my own heart. A sickening realization crept over me. Grandpa's journals had talked about the risks of using certain artifacts, how some of them required a kind of sacrifice in order to work. But he'd never explained exactly what that meant. Now I was starting to understand. The dagger wasn't just a tool. It was a conduit, drawing on the life of whoever wielded it to fuel its power. And the more I used it, the more it drained me. The figure took another step forward, and I could feel a pressure building in the room, like the air was getting thicker. It was harder to breathe, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides, tightening around me. I gripped the dagger even tighter, knowing that if I let go, I might not have the strength to pick it up again. I had to keep going, I had to find a way to push back the darkness before it swallowed me whole. I took a deep breath and began to chant again, this time using words from a different part of Grandpa's journals, a passage I'd only skimmed before, but which seemed to resonate in the back of my mind. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but as I spoke them, the air around me seemed to hum with energy. The glow from the dagger's symbols grew brighter, casting strange, flickering shadows across the chapel walls. The figure hesitated, its form rippling like a mirage. I could see its eyes narrowing, almost as if it was trying to make sense of what I was doing. For a moment, I thought I was making progress. But then the air seemed to tear open, and something emerged from the darkness behind it. Something much larger and far more terrifying than the figure I'd been facing. It was a shape, a mass of writhing limbs and shifting faces, each one distorted in an expression of rage or pain. Its body seemed to be composed of countless human forms melded together, all struggling to break free. The thing loomed over me, a horrible, grotesque fusion of everything that had been sacrificed or consumed to open the breach. And now it was coming for me. The figure in front of me let out a triumphant cry, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "The debt must be paid," it said. "You are the offering." My pulse pounded in my ears, and I realized that the dagger's glow was starting to dim. I was losing my strength, and the chanting wasn't working fast enough. In a desperate move, I lunged toward the altar and grabbed one of the other relics, an old, weathered amulet with a cracked gemstone in its center. I didn't know if it would help, but I had no other choice. I squeezed the amulet in my free hand, willing it to do something, anything. To my shock, the gemstone began to glow, and a faint warmth spread from the amulet into my palm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me the strength to push forward. I held the amulet up, its faint light casting a flickering glow across the monstrous shape in front of me. The thing recoiled slightly, as if the light irritated it, and for the first time, I thought I saw a hint of fear in its many eyes. That tiny glimmer of hope was enough to make me act. I gripped the amulet tightly and pressed it against the blade of the dagger, hoping that combining the two would somehow amplify their power. The effect was immediate. The moment the amulet touched the dagger, a burst of light erupted from the blade, cutting through the darkness with a harsh, searing brilliance. The symbols along the dagger's edge flared brightly, and the dark mass in front of me seemed to writhe in agony, its many faces contorting as the light burned into it. The pressure in the air lessened, and I could feel the shadows beginning to pull away, shrinking back toward the corners of the room. But I wasn't done. I kept chanting, louder now, forcing myself to push through the exhaustion that threatened to drag me down. I could feel the life draining out of me with every word, but I didn't stop. I focused on the figure in front of me, the one that had spoken with such terrible certainty, and I directed all my energy toward it, willing it to be consumed by the light. The creature screamed, a sound so piercing and inhuman that I felt my knees buckle beneath me. I nearly dropped the dagger, but I forced myself to hold on. The light from the blade intensified, flooding the chapel with a brilliant, almost blinding glow. The darkness seemed to dissolve in its wake, the shifting shadows unraveling like smoke in the wind. For a brief, hopeful moment, it felt like I had won. The air felt lighter, and the monstrous shape began to fade, its twisted limbs melting away as the light consumed it. But then I heard a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakably familiar. "Run," it whispered. "Get out now." It was Grandpa's voice. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard his voice in so long, and there was a desperation in it that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't understand. The darkness was retreating. Wasn't that what I wanted? But there was no time to question it. As I turned to leave, I saw the thing's true form for the first time, emerging from the dissolving shadows like a predator revealing itself. It wasn't just one entity. It was a convergence of many, dozens, maybe hundreds of dark spirits that had been trapped together, fused into a single, monstrous consciousness. As the light drove away the shadows, they began to separate, breaking free from the horrible mass that had bound them together. I could see their eyes, countless glowing eyes, all focused on me with a kind of hunger that made my blood run cold. The thing wasn't gone. I had only broken the bindings that held it together. Now its individual parts were free to hunt, free to wreak havoc. And I was the only living thing in the chapel. I turned and ran, the chanting echoing faintly in the back of my mind as I stumbled through the heavy wooden door and out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I gasped for breath as I staggered down the steps. Behind me, the darkness poured out of the chapel, a writhing tide of shadowy forms that spread out in all directions. I heard whispers, low and malicious, growing louder as they closed in. I ran toward the forest, my mind racing. I knew the woods well enough. They'd been my playground growing up. But now, they felt unfamiliar, hostile. The trees seemed to bend toward me, their branches clawing at my clothes and hair. The darkness was everywhere, moving in ways that didn't make sense. It wasn't just night. It was alive, and it was hunting me. The path twisted and turned, but I kept going, my lungs burning with every breath. I could hear them behind me, closer now. Their voices were louder, distinct, each one murmuring something different. Some called my name, others whispered things I couldn't understand, but all of them filled me with a dread that seemed to pierce right through my chest. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I saw it, a faint light ahead, flickering through the trees. I pushed myself toward it, half stumbling, half sprinting. As I burst into the clearing, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the woods, holding a lantern. It was Grandpa, or at least it looked like him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was a fire in his gaze that I remembered. He raised the lantern higher, its light casting long shadows across the ground. "You have to finish it," he said, his voice strained. "There's one more thing you need to do." I didn't understand. I thought I had stopped the darkness. I had broken its form. But Grandpa shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "The breach is still open," he said, "and there's only one way to close it for good." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The sacrifice. The journals had hinted at it, but I'd refused to believe it. The breach could only be sealed by giving something of equal value to what had been taken. And the darkness had already taken so much. Grandpa handed me the lantern, his hand trembling as he did. I could see his sadness in his eyes, a kind of resignation. "You know what you have to do," he said softly. And as I stepped back toward the dark edge of the forest, I knew there was only one choice left to make. My legs trembled as I stood at the threshold of the forest, the darkness churning just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. I glanced back at Grandpa, hoping for some other option, some sign that there was another way. But his gaze didn't waver. He knew as well as I did that there was no other choice. The breach wouldn't close on its own, and the shadows that had escaped were only a fraction of what was trying to come through. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a maddening chorus. The lantern felt heavier in my hand with each step I took toward the edge of the clearing. It was as if the darkness itself was pushing back against the light, resisting my every move. I stopped just before the first line of trees, the lantern's glow casting a faint circle of light on the ground. "Well, what do I have to do?" I asked, though I already feared I knew the answer. My voice shook, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers seemed to converge, forming a singular voice that seeped into my mind. It was Grandpa's voice, but twisted hollow. "You know the price," it said. "A life must be given a life for the breach." My stomach tightened, and I felt a cold dread sink into my bones. I could feel the truth of it like a weight in my chest, a certainty that seemed to pulse in the very air around me. The breach wasn't just a tear between worlds. It was a wound, a gaping maw that demanded to be fed. All those missing people, all the strange occurrences in town, they were part of that demand. And now it wanted more. Grandpa reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial. It glinted faintly in the lantern light, a dark, viscous liquid inside. "This will bind the breach," he said, his voice barely audible. "But only if given willingly." I took the vial from him, my hand trembling so much that I nearly dropped it. The liquid inside seemed to swirl, shifting colors like oil on water. I could feel a faint heat radiating from it, a pulsing warmth that made my skin prickle. A life given willingly. The thought echoed in my mind, and I looked at Grandpa, my chest tightening. "You don't mean..." My voice trailed off as his expression hardened, his eyes filled with a silent plea. "There's no other way," he said, a trace of resignation in his voice. "If you don't do this, it will take the whole town, and it won't stop there." His gaze dropped to the ground, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "It was my burden," he whispered, "but now it's yours." I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, and the lantern felt like dead weight in my hand. The darkness beyond the trees seemed to pulse, waiting for me to make my move. It was as though the forest itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in anticipation. A wave of nausea hit me as I realized what Grandpa was asking. I looked at the vial, then at him. You're asking me to end this," he cut in, his voice firm. "Before it consumes everything." His hand tightened on my shoulder, and I could feel the faintest tremor in his grip. "You have the power," he continued, his eyes boring into mine. "But only if you're willing to pay the price." The weight of his words crushed me. How could he ask this of me? How could he just hand me the vial and expect me to make that choice? The darkness was closing in, and the whispers grew louder, like a swarm of bees in my ears. I could feel the breach pulling at me, a force that seemed to tug at the very essence of my being. I can't," I whispered, shaking my head. My body felt numb, and tears stung the corners of my eyes. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Grandpa said, his voice breaking. "And you know that?" He took a step back, his expression softening as he looked at me. "You're stronger than I ever was. You can end this, but you have to do it now." I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. My fingers tightened around the vial, and I could feel the heat intensify. The world around me seemed to dim, and the darkness pushed closer, pressing against the faint circle of lantern light. It was now or never. I took a step toward the breach, lifting the vial and holding it out before me. The darkness seemed to recoil slightly, as if sensing the choice I was about to make. My hand shook so badly that I almost lost my grip, but I forced myself to keep going one step at a time. I knew what I had to do, even if I couldn't accept it. "Please forgive me," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Without another thought, I uncorked the vial and drank the contents in one gulp. The liquid burned like fire as it slid down my throat, and I collapsed to my knees as a wave of agony surged through my body. It felt like my insides were being torn apart, my veins filled with molten lead. I screamed, clutching my chest as the darkness surged forward, enveloping me. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, everything went black. Then, slowly, a warmth spread through me, starting from my chest and radiating outward. I could feel the breach pulling at me, trying to draw me in, but the light from the lantern seemed to hold it back, flickering brighter and brighter. The pain dulled to a throb, and I realized that I was no longer alone. I looked up and saw them, figures standing at the edge of the light. Faces I recognized. The missing people, they were here, their forms faint and translucent like echoes. They reached out to me, their voices merging into a single, harmonious whisper. "Thank you," they said, as the light around me grew blindingly bright. The breach let out a final, shuddering howl, and then it was gone. The darkness receded, and the air felt still, almost peaceful. I collapsed to the ground, the lantern flickering beside me. Grandpa knelt down, his eyes filled with tears as he gathered me into his arms. "You did it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It's over." But as I lay there, struggling to catch my breath, I couldn't help but wonder if the real darkness hadn't just begun. Because as the light faded and the shadows returned to their normal shapes, I could still hear faint whispers in the distance, growing ever quieter but never truly gone. The quiet that followed was unnerving. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with relief, but rather the sort that settles in after something terrible has happened. I lay there on the damp ground, the forest seeming unnaturally still, and Grandpa's arms wrapped around me like a lifeline. The air was cold, colder than before, and the lantern's light, which had burned so brightly moments ago, now flickered weakly. I tried to sit up, but my whole body felt heavy, like the energy had been drained from my muscles. Grandpa helped me to my feet, his grip trembling. His face was a mixture of pride and grief, and I could see in his eyes that he knew I wasn't the same. Whatever I'd done, whatever I'd given, it had taken something from me that I couldn't get back. "Let's get you home," he said, his voice hoarse. He glanced over his shoulder toward the darkened chapel, then back at me, as if making sure nothing else was coming after us. We walked in silence, the path through the forest winding ahead like a dark tunnel. I clutched the lantern tightly, though its light seemed dimmer than it had been. The chill seeped deeper into my bones with each step, and an uneasy feeling stirred in the back of my mind. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was as though the darkness had left a mark on me, something I couldn't shake. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadows crawling back toward us, or hear the whispers start up again. But there was nothing, only the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of some nocturnal animal. We finally emerged from the woods, and I could see Grandpa's house up ahead, its familiar shape looming like a shadow in the fog. The sight of it brought some small comfort, but the unease didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed us, something unseen that still lingered in the air. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Grandpa guided me to the worn-out couch in the living room, where I collapsed into the cushions, the fatigue washing over me like a wave. I barely registered the sound of him moving around the house, lighting candles and muttering to himself. I heard the creak of the attic door and the faint shuffling of papers, but my eyes were so heavy, I couldn't bring myself to care. All I could do was stare at the darkened window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me from the other side. Grandpa returned, a thick old book in his hands, its leather cover cracked with age. He sat down across from me, placing the book on the coffee table. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice low and serious. "About what happened tonight, about the breach." I forced myself to sit up, the weight of his words pulling me from the brink of sleep. "I thought it was over," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. He shook his head slowly. "You did close the breach, but there are always consequences." His eyes met mine, and I saw the same haunted look I'd noticed when I first found his journals. "The ritual you performed, it saved the town, but it bound you to something dark." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Bound?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "The darkness you drove back. It left a piece of itself behind," Grandpa continued, his gaze falling to the book in front of him. He opened it to a page filled with strange symbols and illustrations of shadowy figures. "When you drank that vial, you didn't just seal the breach, you took a part of it inside you." The words hit me like a blow, and suddenly, the heaviness in my limbs, the lingering chill in the air, made sense. "So, what is inside me now?" My voice trembled, a rising panic clawing at my throat. He nodded grimly. "The breach is closed, but the darkness will try to find a way out again. It will use you to do it." I recoiled, shaking my head in disbelief. "There has to be something we can do, another ritual, a way to get rid of it." Grandpa sighed, his expression softening. "There might be," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous. What you did tonight took a piece of you. If we try to force the darkness out, it could take the rest." The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick and oppressive. I wanted to scream, to lash out at the unfairness of it all, but there was no one to blame except myself. I had made the choice. I had opened the door, and now I was the one who had to keep it closed. Over the next few days, I felt the change growing inside me. It started small, faint whispers at the edge of my hearing, shadows that seemed to move in the corners of my vision. I tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, the whispers became more distinct. They weren't the chaotic murmurs I'd heard in the chapel. These were coherent, and they spoke to me by name. They asked me to let them in, to set them free. The nights were worse. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, with the sense that something was watching me from the darkened corners of the room. One night, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods without remembering how I'd gotten there. It was as though some part of me was being drawn back to the breach, pulled toward the place where it had all begun. Grandpa noticed the change too. He became more protective, insisting that I stay inside after dark and never leaving me alone for long. He kept his old books close at hand, poring over them late into the night. I could tell he was searching for a way to help me, but I could also see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that there might not be a solution. Then, one evening, as I sat in the living room staring at the flickering candlelight, I heard it, the same voice that had whispered to me in the woods. It was clearer now, stronger, as though whatever was inside me was growing more confident. "You can't hide forever," it said, the words slipping into my mind like smoke. "You know what you have to do?" I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head as if I could dislodge the voice. "Go away," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Leave me alone." The laughter that followed was low and guttural, like something old and hungry. "You belong to us now, and soon you will set us free." I stumbled back from the couch, my pulse racing. The room seemed to darken, the candlelight dimming as the shadows stretched toward me. And as the voice faded, I knew with a sickening certainty that the battle was far from over. The darkness hadn't been defeated, it had only been biding its time. And now it was coming back. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the voice faded, leaving the room unnervingly silent. It wasn't the kind of quiet that settles when everything is calm. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I backed away slowly, my gaze locked on the flickering candlelight, as if it could somehow protect me from the darkness encroaching from every side. Grandpa came rushing in, his expression grave as he took in the sight of me standing there, trembling, my eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice laced with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "They're still here," I whispered, my voice breaking. "They're inside my head." He let out a low sigh, and for a moment, I saw the weight of years etched on his face, the toll of a lifetime spent dabbling in things he should have left alone. He stepped closer, his hand resting on my shoulder with a firmness that was meant to be reassuring, but only served to remind me how helpless I felt. "We'll find a way to silence them," he said quietly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his tone. He glanced down at the old book he'd been carrying everywhere, its leather cover now almost as worn as he was. "There's a ritual, but it's dangerous. It could—" "I don't care," I cut in, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I can't live like this, Grandpa. I can't keep fighting them." My voice cracked, and I felt a hot tear roll down my cheek. The darkness was gnawing at the edges of my sanity, and every day it grew harder to distinguish my own thoughts from the whispers that clawed at my mind. He hesitated, then nodded slowly, as though resigning himself to a fate he had hoped to avoid. "Very well," he said, turning toward the fireplace, where the embers still glowed faintly. He threw a few more logs on the fire and crouched down, stirring the coals back to life. "There is one ritual that could work. It will banish the darkness back to where it came from, but you'll have to face it directly." I didn't ask what that meant. I could already feel a deepening coldness in my chest, as though the darkness sensed what we were planning and was tightening its hold on me. Grandpa spread out the book on the coffee table, flipping through the yellowed pages with a speed born of desperation. He stopped on a page covered with arcane symbols, some of which I recognized from the journals I had found in the attic. My stomach twisted as I looked at the strange illustrations. A figure standing within a circle of salt, surrounded by shadowy shapes that seemed to writhe with life. "It's called the Rite of Severance," Grandpa explained, tracing one of the symbols with his gnarled finger. "You'll need to lure the darkness out. Draw it away from your mind and into the circle." He paused, his eyes meeting mine. "But once it's out, it won't want to go back. It will fight to stay free." I swallowed hard, the room seeming to close in around me. "And what happens if I can't drive it back?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His silence told me everything I needed to know. We spent the next few hours preparing the ritual. Grandpa cleared the furniture from the living room, marking a wide circle on the floor with salt and chalk, inscribing runes at each of the cardinal points. He set up candles along the perimeter and placed an old iron bell in the center, explaining that its ringing would call forth the darkness, pulling it out from where it hid. I stood at the edge of the circle, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if they knew what was coming. I could feel them gnawing at the back of my mind, urging me to stop, to walk away and let them be. It took every ounce of willpower. I had to step into the center of the circle and kneel beside the bell. The air felt thick and heavy, as though it was pressing down on me from all sides. Grandpa took a deep breath and began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, his voice resonating with a strange cadence that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The flame of each candle flared brighter, casting elongated shadows on the walls. I gripped the bell tightly, waiting for the signal. "Now," Grandpa's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Ring the bell and speak its name." I hesitated. "Its name?" I asked, confusion knotting my brow. We hadn't spoken about any name before. Grandpa's face was pale, his eyes wide. "The name it whispered to you. The one you heard when you first closed the breach." I could hardly remember. Everything from that night was a blur of pain and terror. But then, as though the darkness itself was whispering it back to me, the name surfaced in my mind. It felt like ice against my thoughts, a presence that was both alien and familiar. I lifted the bell and spoke the name aloud, my voice trembling as the sound left my lips. The moment the word hung in the air, the room seemed to bend, the shadows twisting and elongating unnaturally. The whispers surged, turning into a chorus of voices, some pleading, some taunting, some screaming. I rang the bell, and the sound was like a knife slicing through the darkness. The shadows converged, pouring into the circle like a living thing, writhing and churning as they formed a vaguely human shape. It towered above me, a mass of darkness with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. I could feel it pulling at me, reaching out with tendrils of cold that wrapped around my limbs, tightening their grip as they sought to drag me out of the circle. Grandpa's voice rose in a furious chant, the words falling from his lips with desperate urgency. I forced myself to stand, fighting against the pull of the darkness as I began to repeat the chant, my voice joining his in a strained harmony. The shadows recoiled, their form destabilizing, as if the ritual was forcing it to split apart. But the darkness wasn't giving up. I felt a sharp pain stab into my mind, like a clawed hand digging deep, searching for something to hold on to. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I saw flashes of the breach, its gaping maw, the figures that had reached out to me that night. The darkness was trying to pull me back in, to make me part of it once again. Grandpa reached out, his hand gripping my shoulder. "Don't let go," he shouted, his voice strained and raw. "You have to drive it back. It's almost done." I pushed back with everything I had, focusing on the chant, on the light of the candles that burned around me. The darkness writhed and screamed, its form collapsing in on itself as the circle of salt glowed with a blinding white light. I rang the bell one final time, and the sound echoed like thunder, shattering the last of the shadows into nothingness. The room fell silent. The candles flickered out, and the salt circle lay undisturbed. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my limbs shaking from the exertion. Grandpa knelt beside me, his face lined with exhaustion, but also a glimmer of relief. "It's done," he said softly. "The darkness is gone." But as I lay there, staring up at the darkened ceiling, I couldn't help but feel that something had stayed behind. Something small, almost imperceptible. It lingered just at the edge of my awareness, like a faint whisper, too quiet to make out but still there. In the weeks that followed, life seemed to return to a cautious kind of normal. Grandpa and I settled back into our routines, though I could tell he was always keeping a close eye on me. The weight of the ritual lingered, a kind of quiet understanding between us that even though the darkness was gone, we would never be quite the same. I tried to move on, to forget the way the shadows had clawed at my mind and the whispers had wormed their way into my thoughts. But some things wouldn't let go. At first, it was just the little things that seemed off, like the occasional flicker of the lights, or the way I sometimes felt a chill despite the summer heat. I'd find myself staring into dark corners, half expecting to see something watching me from the shadows. I tried to brush it off as nerves, the after effects of everything I had been through. But then, the dreams started. Each night, I found myself back in the forest, standing on the edge of the clearing where the old chapel had once been. In the dreams, the structure was whole again, but it was always dark inside, an inky blackness that seemed to bleed out from the open doorway. I could hear whispers drifting out of the darkness, calling my name in voices that were both familiar and twisted. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sound of my name still ringing in my ears. The worst part was, I'd sometimes wake to find myself standing in the living room, staring blankly out the window, as if I had been sleepwalking. It happened again and again, always around 3 in the morning, always in the same place, facing the woods. Grandpa tried to reassure me, told me it was probably just stress, but I saw the worry in his eyes. He started locking the doors at night and hid the key to the attic, as if he suspected that some part of me might try to go back up there. The feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger with each passing day. I started hearing faint noises at night, like a soft scratching at the walls or the creak of footsteps just outside my door. I tried to tell myself it was just the old house settling, but there was a pattern to the sounds, a rhythm that almost seemed deliberate. The feeling of being watched grew more intense, as if the darkness was pressing in from all sides, and I couldn't shake the sensation that it was trying to find a way back. One night, the scratching became so loud it jolted me awake. I sat up in bed, the darkness around me feeling suffocating, and the sound continued, a steady scrape, 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 coming from the direction of the attic. I threw back the covers and stumbled out into the hallway, my pulse racing as I moved toward the noise. It was coming from behind the locked attic door. I knew Grandpa had the only key, and yet as I drew closer, I could see the faint outline of light leaking out from the cracks around the frame. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, rhythmic tapping, as if someone or something was knocking from the other side. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just random noise. It was a pattern like a code. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted down the hallway to Grandpa's room. I shook him awake, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush as I told him about the noises and the light in the attic. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the key from his nightstand and rushed to the attic door, with me trailing behind him. He unlocked the door and pushed it open with a creak. The light I'd seen was gone, leaving only darkness. The air inside the attic felt cold and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. But as Grandpa stepped inside, I could have sworn I saw a shadow shift at the edge of the lantern's light. We searched the attic together, but there was nothing there. Just the same old boxes of dusty relics and books piled in the corners. Grandpa set the lantern down and turned to me, his face stern. "We're sealing this up for good," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Whatever it was that we brought back, it's trying to get in again." We boarded up the attic door that night. Grandpa carved symbols into the wood, muttering chants under his breath, and I helped him nail the boards in place. For a few nights, the house was quiet again, and I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, we had finally put an end to it. But then, 3 nights later, the dreams changed. I was back in the woods, standing in front of the old chapel. Only this time, there was a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, dark shape with glowing yellow eyes. It didn't speak, but I could feel it calling to me, urging me forward. I tried to turn away, to wake myself up, but I couldn't move. The darkness seemed to wrap around my limbs, pulling me toward the chapel. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening roar inside my skull. I woke with a start, gasping for air, only to find myself standing once again in the living room, facing the window. My hands were cold, and there was dirt beneath my fingernails, as if I had been digging in the ground. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to the kitchen, flipping on the lights. That's when I saw it. There on the kitchen table lay a small, worn piece of parchment. The edges were frayed, and the surface was covered in faded symbols. Symbols I recognized from the old book we'd used for the ritual. I didn't remember seeing it before, and when I asked Grandpa about it the next morning, his face went pale. "This wasn't here yesterday," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He reached out to touch the parchment, then recoiled as though it burned. "It's a calling card, a warning." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. He met my eyes, the fear in his gaze unmistakable. "The darkness isn't gone," he said. "It's found a way back." The dread settled over me like a shroud. The signs were all there, the dreams, the noises, the way I kept waking up in strange places. Whatever we had driven out, it hadn't left. It had simply changed tactics. Now, it was trying to lure me back, to draw me closer, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist. That night, the whispers returned with a vengeance, louder and more urgent than before. I lay awake, clutching the covers to my chest, as the shadows seemed to stretch toward me. reaching out with unseen hands. And somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, I could swear I heard my own voice calling back. The night dragged on, the weight of fear pressing down on me until it felt like I was suffocating. The whispers crept closer, weaving in and out of my thoughts, growing louder and more persuasive. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices still seeped through, like poison running through my veins. They were no longer just whispers. They were calls, beckoning me to come closer, to join them. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was right outside my door, waiting for a moment of weakness to slip inside. It wanted me. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my resolve, trying to find a crack to slip through. I fought to stay awake, but exhaustion clawed at my mind, dragging me down into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I found myself once more standing in the living room, my heart racing. This time, though, I felt different. A sense of urgency coursed through me. The parchment still lay on the table, and I picked it up, examining it closely. The symbols glowed faintly in the light, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Grandpa," I called, my voice shaking. "We need to do something about this." He entered the room, his face pale as he took in the parchment. "It's a summoning," he said slowly, his voice heavy with dread. "It's trying to pull you back into the dark." I shook my head, frustration boiling inside me. "But we can't let it. There has to be a way to stop it." Grandpa nodded, his eyes narrowing in thought. "There is one last ritual we can try," he said finally, his tone serious. "It will require a sacrifice, though. We need to sever whatever connection the darkness has to you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. "A sacrifice?" I asked, fear creeping in again. "What kind of sacrifice?" He looked away, his face lined with the weight of countless secrets. "You must confront the darkness directly. It will require your trust and a willingness to face what it has shown you. The ritual will be dangerous, and you may not come back the same." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the darkness thrumming just beneath the surface, a sinister echo of its presence still lingering in my mind. "I'll do it," I said, forcing the words out even as my stomach twisted with uncertainty. "I can't keep living like this." Grandpa nodded, a hint of pride mixed with fear in his eyes. We began preparing for the ritual, gathering what we needed: candles, salt, the iron bell, and a few other items from the attic. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as though unseen eyes were following my every move. The air was thick with tension, and I found myself glancing nervously at the shadows creeping along the walls. That night, we set everything up in the living room, creating a larger circle than before. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with unspoken fears and the remnants of the darkness we had fought. The flickering candlelight cast erratic shadows, and I felt a cold breeze whip through the room, carrying with it the faintest echoes of laughter. "Are you ready?" Grandpa asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. I took a deep breath, nodding resolutely. "Let's do this." As we began the incantation, the shadows in the room seemed to respond, swirling in time with our words. I could feel the darkness tugging at me, trying to find an entry point, and I steeled myself against its pull. The moment I spoke the name from the parchment, the shadows surged, thickening around us until they formed a tangible wall of darkness. And then it came. It emerged from the void, a swirling mass of shadow and whispers, coalescing into a figure that stood before me, eyes glowing like embers in the night. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed, its voice a cacophony of the damned. "You are mine, child. You have always been mine." I felt a jolt of fear course through me, but I gritted my teeth and pressed on, forcing myself to speak despite the ice that gripped my heart. "I won't let you take me. I'm not afraid of you." As I spoke those words, the darkness recoiled slightly, but it quickly regained its form, laughter bubbling up from its depths. Afraid? You have every reason to be afraid. You think you've escaped me? You're merely a puppet, dancing on my strings. Grandpa's voice cut through the air, stronger now. You will not take her. This ends tonight. The darkness lunged, tendrils of shadow reaching out to wrap around my throat. Panic surged, and I fought back, clenching my fists and digging deep into the core of my resolve. I focused on the light of the candles, on the warmth of my grandfather beside me. I was not alone. Release her, I shouted, my voice echoing as I lifted my hands to the darkness. I felt the energy from the circle surging around me, a protective barrier against the encroaching shadows. You have no power here. The air crackled, and I began to chant the words from the parchment again, pushing the darkness away. As I did, the figure writhed, the tendrils recoiling in agony. I could feel the warmth of the candles intensifying, the light growing brighter until it flooded the room, driving the shadows back. "No!" the creature howled, its voice a symphony of rage and despair. "You cannot do this. You belong to me. I belong to myself." I cried, and with a final surge of energy, I brought my hands down, sealing the circle and the connection it had to me. The shadows shrieked, twisting and writhing, until they began to unravel like smoke dissipating in the wind. The room exploded with light, and I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the heat envelop me. The air shimmered with energy, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the living room, collapsed on the floor, breathing heavily. Grandpa was at my side, his hand resting gently on my back. "You did it," he murmured, relief flooding his voice. "You banished it?" I nodded, but I still felt a lingering chill, a sense that something had shifted within me. I looked around the room, the candles flickering softly in the aftermath. The shadows had receded, but a small part of me felt different, less tethered to the darkness and yet more aware of its presence. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to regain its rhythm. The nightmares faded, replaced by a new sense of purpose. I spent time with Grandpa, learning more about his work and the secrets he had kept. Together, we formed a plan to ensure that the darkness would never return, sealing away the remnants of the past. But deep down, I knew the shadows would always be a part of me. I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, but I had also learned to listen to its whispers, to understand that light and dark exist in a delicate balance. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a faint breeze ruffle my hair. For a moment, I could almost hear the whispers again, but this time they were different, softer, like a distant memory rather than a threat. I closed my eyes, allowing the feeling to wash over me. A reminder that I was not defined by what had happened, but by how I chose to face it. I had confronted the darkness and had come back from it, and now I stood ready to embrace whatever came next. The whispers may linger, but I was no longer afraid. I was free.
Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey into the unknown. If this story left you with goosebumps or a lingering sense of dread, then you're exactly where you need to be. There's so much more to uncover, and each tale gets darker, more terrifying, and closer to the truth than the last. So, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Brace yourself for more real-life horror stories that will keep you up at night. Stay curious, stay cautious, and I'll see you in the next tale if you dare.